Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll take a look at the damage that George W. Bush continues to inflict on America through his lifetime court appointments. We'll also tell you about the real IRS scam that conservatives are being strangely quiet about, and we'll take a closer look at one of the most dangerous and unhinged right-wing hate talkers out there. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you just stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
When Republicans thought that the IRS was unfairly targeting the Tea Party groups for breaking tax laws, they had a hard time talking about anything else. But recently, IRS whistleblowers came forward and exposed a real scandal from within the agency. And conservative media is strangely silent, but we won't be. Joining me now to talk about the real IRS scandal is attorney Chris Paulos. Chris, these stories that are coming out almost monthly about the IRS preserving the rights of corporations, multinational corporations, to steal trillions of dollars, no exaggeration, trillions of dollars from American taxpayers, and at the same time, within the organization, their goal is to target individuals that, you know, it may be $10,000 here, $3,000 there. Go after those individuals for $2, $3, $4, $5, $20,000, and let these thugs, these corporate thugs, steal away trillions of dollars overseas. What's happening within the IRS? This is a very ugly development.
That's true, Pap. It's been a bad press month or so for the IRS. As you know, they apparently have been enforcing this whistleblower provision very loosely against corporations. As you said, they go after small-time tax cheats and press the elderly and small businesses, and they squeeze every dime out of them. But when it comes to these multi-billion-dollar tax cheats who are hiding nearly $5 trillion offshore from the U.S. government, they turn a blind eye, or they do a farcical investigation and then decide not to prosecute.
Okay, well, what is the whistleblower? In other words, there's a statute that says when somebody catches a corporation or an individual stealing taxpayers' money by tax fraud, then they have a right to bring that case and say to the IRS, we want a part of that because we've done your work for you.
Yeah, certainly.
Now, so that sounds very important. But what you're saying is that where it comes to multinational corporations, they're letting them steal trillions of dollars, but mom and pop that might have a store on the street corner, they're going after mom and pop like brown shirts.
That's correct, Pap. Since about 1867, the IRS has had a tool in its hands to prosecute tax frauds. And it wasn't until about 1986 that the IRS was capable of providing a bounty to private citizens who reported tax cheats. Now, the law is designed to go after corporations. Tax cheats who can receive a reward for reporting these types of frauds to the IRS, the fraudster has to have a minimum income of about $200,000 and must have cheated the government of over $2 million in taxes. Those income thresholds are designed to go after big-time tax cheats like these corporations, and sadly, the IRS has sat on their hands, hasn't lifted a finger really to employ this tool as effectively as it could. Occasionally, they'll announce a whistleblower reward or a successful tax fraud prosecution using this law, but based on the amount of tax fraud that occurs on an annual basis, the amount that's being recovered by the IRS using this law is a pittance.
Well, doesn't this all fall at the feet of the Deputy Commissioner, John Dalper? I mean, he's the guy that is in charge of, he should be overseeing this. The chief counsel for the IRS should be saying to these whistleblowers, thank you for bringing these cases. Investigators should then be doing their work. Criminal division should be doing its work. But if I follow these stories that are, no exaggeration, are appearing almost every month, that talks about what a terrible failure the IRS has become because they've become an extension of these corporate thugs. And how did that happen, I guess, is my question. I mean, how does a guy that's supposed to do his job, how is he forgiven for not doing his job for so long?
Well, that's exactly right, Pap. What's coming out of the IRS right now with some actual whistleblowers themselves reporting the conduct of the IRS is that the executive agents or at the executive level in the IRS is just too comfortable and too cozy with the very corporations that are committing these tax frauds. If you think about it, these IRS agents, particularly top level executives in the IRS, where are they going to go when they're done working for the government? They're going to feed right into these corporations, and in essence, they're being asked to prosecute their future employers. And it's no surprise that prosecutions of these corporations have fallen flat, have grown stale, are not pushed as hard as they possibly can. And then they turn around and they start prosecuting, like we said, mom and pop businesses and the elderly for tax fraud. It's just an uneven balance of prosecution of these types of cases.
I'm sitting here looking at cases that have been reported just in last several months. You've got in one case, the IRS auditing a U.S. company for fraudulently underreporting $3 billion. The whistleblower came forward. Extreme details, showed them where everything was buried, where the documents were, submitted documents, showed as much as a $4 billion tax loss for taxpayers and the government, and extremely solid case, and the IRS did nothing with that. Another one, $6 billion. They basically, again, the whistleblower comes forward with all of the details. Not just I think or I heard or it's not hearsay. Here it is, Mr. IRS. Here are the details. They stole $6 billion, and what ends up happening is the IRS shuts it down, and even the criminal division, the criminal agents say that it's simply because senior IRS executives and their outside contacts shut this down. Now, is that the pattern that you're seeing? I mean, this is your specialty. You deal with whistleblowers day in, day out. Is this the pattern that you're seeing?
Well, that seems to be the case. I mean, it is pretty unprecedented where insiders of the IRS are now coming forward. People who were given the opportunity or told to investigate these cases, who've worked with these whistleblowers to build these cases, they themselves are now pounding their head against a wall trying to get the IRS to pull the trigger on these prosecutions, to push these prosecutions over the finish line, to hold these corporations accountable, and they're not able to. And so now they're stepping forward and complaining about this executive level of management at the IRS who is refusing to prosecute these fraudsters. That in and of itself is somewhat new, and it's interesting, and I think it speaks to how egregious the conduct at the IRS is, I guess how blind they are, or purposefully blind they are to these types of frauds, and they're not willing to go after even the biggest tax cheats.
And when you talk to whistleblowers about that, I guess you have to disclose, thank you for coming forward. It's going to be a tough road because the people in charge at the IRS have this love affair with large corporations. In other words, an Exxon or name it, if it's a big corporation, they can steal us blind. But if mom and pop that owns a donut shop on down the street corner, if they try it, they're going to come in with SWAT teams and assault vehicles and close mom and pop down. Isn't that kind of the pattern we're seeing in the United States right now?
Yeah, and you know, it's one of the failings, I believe, of this IRS whistleblower law is it gives the IRS a lot of discretion with the types of cases that they want to prosecute, and that is something that you have to tell one of these brave men or women who step forward, who put their career, potentially their job, on the line to report these types of frauds, to say, you know what, you may hand the IRS a case on a silver platter. It's a slam dunk case, and the IRS may not even take that case. I think the arbitrariness, the latitude with which the IRS is given to select these cases is somewhat dangerous, and leads to this type of corruption. And I do think it is corruption at the IRS that is causing them to turn the blind eye to these particular types of cases. So. Go ahead.
And so what you have is, if your numbers are correct that you're seeing and that are reported time and time again, you're talking about $5 trillion just offshore that the IRS could do something about. How much has the IRS collected by way of whistleblowers? Just put a comparison to how much is out there and how much they've actually used this law to collect.
Well, in the last 3 years, the IRS has collected just $1 billion in tax fraud money. They've paid out about $106 million to whistleblowers, and that sounds impressive. I mean,
no,
in
that's
fact,
not. It doesn't sound impressive.
Well,
not when
the IRS puts this out in press releases to say that this law is working. But when you know the true amount of money that's being hidden from the IRS or that's being withheld by these corporations that they should be paying to the U.S. government, like you said, in offshore havens alone, $5 trillion. So these numbers actually are not impressive at all. In fact, I think it's a simple drop. It's a drop in the ocean of tax fraud that's being committed on an annual basis.
And the truth is, the IRS knows about it, and they know that it's a lot easier to go after mom and pop's donut shop that owes them $10,000 and close down mom and pop's donut shop and let the Exxon caliber corporations steal us blind. Chris, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you.
Most historians already agree that George W. Bush was one of the worst presidents in the history of this country. And even though he's been out of office for 6 years, his judicial appointments continue to wreak havoc on society, and they're going to likely do that for a lifetime. Joining me now to talk about one of the worst Republican-packed circuit courts in America is David Haynes. David, the Fifth Circuit federal system is really making a pretty ugly name for itself, according to the articles we're seeing. I mean, Mother Jones did an incredible expose on this. What's your take? What's happening over there in the Fifth Circuit, and what kind of impact is it having on people in general that live in Texas, Mississippi? Because that's the area that it hits, Texas, Mississippi, and I really do believe it's devastating some of their rights.
It truly is, Pap. This is the reach of President George W. Bush's legacy is continuing to live on. It's having a tremendous impact on the public, on consumers, particularly on several key issues which are going to continue to come up before this court, which is stacked with Republican ideologues. These issues include voter ID, suppressing people, keeping voters away from the courts, as well as gerrymandering issues, ensuring Republicans keep control of the House. Women's rights issues such as abortion, equal pay, and so forth, as well as death penalty issues. There've been a number of issues, of course, coming out of Texas, where they execute more people than any other state in the country, regardless of whether these folks are mentally ill or not, as well as anti-consumer decisions and anti-environmental decisions where they're favoring large oil and gas companies. So,
well, let's back up on that. That is an incredible list, because that covers just every aspect of our culture, David. I mean, that's what's so scary about that. For example, the voting issue in Texas. The latest news was they're preventing 600,000. The Fifth Circuit is ruled to prevent 600,000 registered voters. I mean, people who have been registered for years to go vote. Now they've prevented them from voting under this scam voter ID thing that Texas is trying to push.
Exactly.
Tell us about
and here's a decision where we had a lengthy trial in the trial court where the judge heard all the evidence for many weeks, gave a very reasoned ruling as to why this particular law was unconstitutional and inappropriate. It basically amounted to a poll tax, and it prevented registered voters from coming to the polls. There's very little, if any, fraud at all. And then you have the ideologues on the Fifth Circuit basically reverse the trial court's very reasoned decision in order to keep people away from the polls. It's just a politically motivated decision, bottom line.
In other words, David, it was a full trial. The presentation was, you had people in Texas that worked on the law that were actually admitting that, yes, this is to prevent minorities from voting. They knew 600,000 voters were going to be stricken from the rolls who had voted year after year simply because they don't have this card. Military individuals, for example, that have a military ID that served overseas fighting for the country can come back and show their military ID, and that's not enough. A student that is going to school there, simply, going to school there, they can't use their student ID that shows clearly they're, what. But, okay, so who leads the charge on the Fifth Circuit? Most of the time, you hear a couple of names come up all the time that are really the ugliest of the ugly ideologues. Tell us about, and they're women, by the way, too, just horrid women. Tell us about this.
You really have several of them. Priscilla Owen is one from Texas, came up from the Texas Supreme Court and has had some decisions were very, very unfortunate. Edith Brown Clement is another one who authored a dissent favoring BP, which was, the rest of the court even was voting to uphold the settlement agreement in that case. Edith Jones is another one of these justices who's coming out of the Federalist Society. So the Republicans are training these folks up, putting them on some of the lower courts, and then bringing them up on the appellate courts with the idea of training up future U.S. Supreme Court justices. Several women, as you mentioned, and the Democrats need to be doing a better job to counter these sort of intellectual heavyweights from the right, who obviously have very poor reasoning and logic, but the Democrats need to do a better job of developing their bench, so to speak, to counter these Republicans.
Well, let's talk about how specifically crazy at least a couple of these women there that you're talking about really are. Talk about some of the decisions they've made, how they've justified abortion, how they've justified killing people that were clearly insane, how they justified trying to give BP a free pass after BP had signed off on a clear agreement saying that they were going to do A, B, and C, and then said, oh, gee whiz, the BP lawyers were too stupid. We made a mistake. Tell us about how crazy this rationale is coming from these sweetheart Fifth Circuit types that are being groomed for the U.S. Supreme Court.
Absolutely. On the women's rights issues, to start on the abortion issues, essentially what they're doing is rendering opinions that is eliminating a woman's right to reproductive choice. In Texas, they got down to one clinic in Mississippi, but in Texas, they essentially shut down more than half of the clinics. Women have to drive several hundred miles, and there are a number of ways that they're doing this, saying that the doctors have to have privileges at the nearby hospital, that these clinics have to be up to the top hospital standards of surgical clinics and so forth. Anything they can do to justify denying women these rights on that issue. Time and again, very strong opinions on that. And these are coming, we're the playbook right from the Federalist Society and some of these other extreme social groups. On the death penalty issue out of Texas, there's never been an execution really that's been prevented of a mentally ill person. We have lawyers sleeping through trial and they still execute the defendant.
In other words, the argument was to the Supreme Court, look, it's clear they had him on record sleeping through about 3/4 of the defense, even though the judge was trying to wake him up, the jury was commenting about it, and this guy's fighting for his life and the lawyer's asleep and they say okay. And then the BP thing, this is just remarkable that you have, Clemens is her name, that is just taking the position that we're going to give BP a free pass because BP's lawyers were too stupid? Isn't that basically what she has agreed to here?
Essentially, that this very sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar multinational company had a very large number of large law firms working for them, that they weren't sophisticated enough. Clearly, this is just pandering to the oil and gas interests out of Texas and Louisiana. These are defendants that are consistently before this court. Clement has shown a clear bias towards them, and her dissent in that case has been described as just screaming out for the U.S. Supreme Court to step in, which fortunately they did not and should not.
Well, they still might. They still might. But she's, of course, personal friends with Antonin Scalia, and that's what she's counting on. Look, David, I hope we can turn it around this next presidential cycle, because Obama has not done a lot to turn this around. It's pretty scary when you really think about it.
He needs to get more aggressive, Pap, on these nominees.
Yeah. Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Pap.
Big business interest groups want to limit your access to take them to court when their products or actions harm you. They tell us that frivolous lawsuits are clogging up our legal system. It is an utter lie, and they know it's a lie. And they're right about a glut of lawsuits, but it's big business lawsuits that are doing the clogging. Joining me now to explain this is Linda Lipsen, the CEO of American Association for Justice. You know, it's amazing, Linda. It seems like you have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce all the time for the last 20 years have been trying to cut off the right of somebody who's injured, somebody who's been defrauded, just to the average citizen. They want to cut off their right to go to court. They're trying to close the courthouse door to where they can't get a jury trial. But I took a look, it's almost every week the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is suing another corporation or somebody on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The very people who are trying to shut these doors. Talk about this a little bit. It's such hypocrisy.
It's galling. They file 100 suits a year involving the companies that they represent. And so they're not trying to shut the courthouse doors for themselves. they're trying to just shut the courthouse doors for individuals who are seeking redress through the courts for injuries from dangerously defective products or dangerous medicine. This is the height of hypocrisy. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince the public that they're actually suing too much, when every data point that we've seen shows that is declining every year, and businesses are suing businesses, and that's where most of the activity is lying, but no one knows it. So it's the height of hypocrisy, and we're trying to get the word out.
Well, one way they're doing it is they're attacking the people who bring lawsuits. In other words, if mom and pop has been defrauded by Wall Street and Goldman Sachs has stolen $100,000 from their pension programs, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce comes out and tries to victimize mom and pop for having the audacity to sue Goldman Sachs or any of the Wall Street types, because U.S. Chamber of Commerce gets all of their money from the Wall Street fat cats that steal so much damn money. So that's part of that. But the media they never explain this part of the story. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't represent mom and pop.
No, they're representing huge conglomerates, multinational corporations, and they are intent on one thing, which is to shut the courthouse doors for ordinary Americans. It's unfair, and it needs to be exposed.
Seems like one way they're doing it is attack the victims and attack lawyers. You know, any lawyer who brings a case for somebody who's been blinded or crippled by a pharmaceutical, all of a sudden they become an ambulance chaser. And so the average American public just doesn't even look behind the story to understand what's happening to them, and they're becoming victims. I mean, the average American is becoming a victim because they are so unwilling to really get the true story. I don't know if it's ignorance, laziness, stupidity. I don't know what it is.
You know, what people forget, or what sometimes what the media forgets, is that these are constitutionally protected rights, and that just as businesses have the right to go into a courthouse and vindicate their rights, so does your neighbor, so does your grandmother, so does your school, so does the person that's teaching your kids. All Americans have the right to do this under the Constitution. Yet companies that are part of the conglomerate that is the Chamber of Commerce are trying to prevent ordinary people from going into court. It's just wrong. I'll give you one just great example of this. The Koch brothers have spent, an enormous amount of money trying to convince America that lawsuits are bad. Yet William Koch actually filed a lawsuit against a winemaker because he didn't think that he bought a wine that he thought was went back to Jefferson's collection, and because he found out that it didn't, he decided to sue this wine company. I mean, that is.
Sounds a little frivolous to me. Well, let me ask you this. But at the same time, you have BP. This is a great example. Let's talk about U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Tens and tens of thousands of people's lives destroyed. An entire ecosystem all along the Gulf Coast where mom and pop businesses are just lined up all the way from Texas to the end of Florida, all of them losing money, lost huge money because of the BP spill. What does the U.S. Chamber of Commerce do? They sign off on a petition for BP, on behalf of BP, to the U.S. Supreme Court saying, oh, please, on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, do not hold BP responsible for any of this. That's what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is doing. So they joined a lawsuit for the corporation, but they wouldn't join the lawsuit for the very people they should be representing.
Can you imagine if all of the hundreds of millions of dollars they're spending to try to convince America that there's a lawsuit crisis instead of a public safety crisis? Could you imagine if they spent all of those dollars to try to make those products safe? How much better we would all be? How much safer our country would be? I mean, this is just it's a smokescreen. It needs to be exposed. We're in the business of exposing it. And we're recommending that the companies really focus on spending their resources to make the products that they're producing safe for the American public.
Let's look at some other ones. FedEx, FedEx joins, they're part of the don't sue anybody crowd. But when somebody even starts to make furniture out of their FedEx kind of boxes, which this is a lawsuit, honestly. Some guys manufacturing furniture from FedEx boxes. FedEx comes in with the full force of FedEx, sues him, and then the next day they send money to the organizations that want to stop lawsuits. Johnson & Johnson, another great example.
Exactly.
They make more pharmaceuticals and more devices that kill people than and I deal with them all the time. I can tell you they're ranked at least in the top 3. They want to stop lawsuits.
But why? Sue the Red Cross. They sued the Red Cross because they didn't like the Red Cross's insignia because they thought that it looked very similar to their insignia. So
yeah, well, John Boehner, how about that? John Boehner the same way. Once all completely against lawsuits, but what does he turn around and do?
He wants to sue the president for aspects of the Affordable Care Act, and he also wanted to sue on behalf of the Defense of Marriage Act because he was mad at the Justice Department for not enforcing the Defense of Marriage Act, which has now been shown to be unconstitutional.
Well, again, I blame this mostly on corporate media because corporate media makes all their money from these corporations. But I also blame it on the stupidity of the average American who won't find out what the truth is. And here is the truth. Linda Lipsen, thank you for joining me. Thanks for what the AAJ does to protect consumers out there every single day. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Are you ready? The Pap Attack.
In July 2008, an unhinged right-wing freak by the name of Jim David Atkinson walked into a Knoxville, Tennessee church, and he opened fire on the congregation during a youth choir performance. He killed 2 people and seriously injured 7 others. When police searched his home, they found a manifesto that he had written. He said that he picked that particular church because of their alleged liberal leanings and their promotion of liberal ideas. They also found a library filled with right-wing hate talk books from Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck and Michael Savage. Atkinson spent most of his adult life listening to the right-wing hate talkers telling him that America was under attack from liberals, that liberals wanted to destroy and emasculate America, and that liberals wanted to take away his rights. All of those things were mentioned in his manifesto, but if you've paid attention to the right-wing hate talkers over the years, they also echo the words of right-wing king of hate, the absolute king of hate, Michael Savage. In fact, Atkinson's manifesto looked like Savage himself could have written it. Savage is unique within the right-wing hate machine. Few people pay much attention to his insane, inflammatory remarks that he makes almost on a daily basis. But they do so, and you know what? It puts them in peril. Savage has a rabid audience that's capable of committing truly horrific acts, as we saw with Jim Atkinson. Savage changed his name early in his career from Michael Weiner, if you can imagine. He claims that he didn't want to be known as a typical Bronx Jew. Those are his words. And he came up with a name that he felt sounded a little more masculine. Weiner knew that he wasn't the only one suffering from severe insecurity about his own masculinity, and so he began his talk radio career by exploiting the irrational fears of other right-wing crybabies. That's who seems to want to listen to Michael the Weiner. Weiner drew on his own experiences dealing with his insecurities to help manipulate the insecurities of his audience. So when he goes on the air and mocks an Iraq war veteran with PTSD and tells him to man up and stop acting like a crybaby, Weiner isn't talking to the caller as much as he's talking to himself.
I am so sick and tired of everyone with their complaints about PTSD, depression. See, I was raised a little differently. I was raised to fight weakness. I was raised to fight pain. I was raised to fight depression, not to give into it. Not to cave into it and cry like a little baby in bed. Boo-hoo-hoo! Boo-hoo-hoo! And you need men like me to save the country. You need men to stand up and say, stop crying like a baby over everything. Stand up already.
You see, Weiner just can't find enough courage to not be scared of the changing world around him. He's terrified, just like his listeners. They're afraid of every damn thing that's new and different. So he does what every bully does in that situation. He demonizes that terrifies him. His attacks on liberals and gays and minorities and women and immigrants and Muslims and everyone else who isn't an old white guy represent the things that he fears. And by convincing his audience to fear these things, he doesn't feel quite insecure. He doesn't feel quite as alone in his Michael Weenie world. There's a book on the market called The Eliminationist, How Hate Talk Radicalized the American Right. It's a book that helps us understand the connections between fringe Tea Party type messaging and hate crime. Xenophobe, homophobe, demophobe, Obamaphobe, taxphobe, choicephobe, governmentphobe. Name the fear and you can match it to a Tea Party message that panders to the most terrified, simpleton, impressionable minds in the room with the other Tea Partiers. The author of the book, David Nywert, says that there's a formula that promotes the terminally unsophisticated and disturbed parts of the politically right audience to do more than just to listen about hate messaging. They want to participate as much as they can. The basic principle behind the formula is to appeal to the most fearful, the most intellectually challenged portion of a listening audience. Once you get that crowd's attention, the next step is to demonize, dehumanize, and in a sense objectify the hate talker target. And then that allows the hate talker to more easily characterize the government or the Latino or the liberal or the Muslim, the abortion doctor, or even the President of the United States as a traitor or a criminal or an opponent to everything that's righteous and decent. The process is called eliminationism. It's a process that encourages the contempt talker's audience to ridicule, to suppress, and to ignore opinions that are different from those of the audience. I've interviewed Nywert dozens of times over the years, and he has an interesting way of describing eliminationism. He told me that it's the equivalent of allowing a village idiot to wander around through town square poking everyone he dislikes in the eye with a sharp stick. His book points out that some villagers have enough courage, enough intellect to stop the idiot, the lunatic, but others don't have a sense enough to realize that the lunatic has recruited them and has actually handed them their own sharp stick. That is the Michael Savage audience, an audience of lunatics. In the end, a pathetic and impressionable right-wing fringe lunatic murderer. He murders innocent churchgoers, or they fly their plane into an IRS building, or they murder an abortion doctor. And we see that the process of eliminationism was successful once again. And we see that the ignorant hate divide diatribe by oddballs like Michael Savage Weiner are not exactly funny ha-ha moments. And the worst part is that there's no consequences for people like Michael Weiner, and he just goes on with his life, onto his multi-million-dollar syndication deal, and he continues to write hate-filled books that terrify his audience and make that book into bestsellers. Fear sells, hate sells. Michael Weiner has become one hell of a salesman because nobody is more afraid of the world than Michael Savage the Weiner. Republicans have found a new rallying cry for their base. It's getting their followers to be angry about the fact that Obama is an imperial president, that Obama has become a king-like president. In the same breath they say that, though, they're saying time and time again how he is ineffective, how he won't lead. Well, they can't have it both ways. I've got Howard Nations here to talk about that very issue. Howard, New York Times did a great article where they talked about this contradiction that we're seeing coming from the right. It is on one breath, they're saying this is an imperial presidency. He's proclaimed himself the king. And then in the next breath, they say he barely is able to govern this nation. Constantly, those two themes are what we're hearing. Now, the interesting thing to me is that the followers, the teabagger Republican followers, are so, I guess, so dull-brained that they don't even see there's a contradiction here. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, on one hand, they're saying Obama is weak and ineffective, especially in foreign policy, and he leads from behind. They tried to reach Osama bin Laden for a comment on that, but as usual, the Republicans couldn't find him. But they also say Obama is conducting imperial presidency, overstepping his constitutional authority and choosing which laws to follow. But you got to understand that the target demographic of these conflicting messages is the Republican base, which is unencumbered by reason or logic, so it shouldn't be a problem for them to sell this message.
Well, it is, but Howard, at some times, don't you just step back and you say, look, have we become so dumbed down that even the people delivering the message are shameless about the idea? You know, as I say, they're concerned about executive orders. They say this is a president who is ignoring the American public, going forward with executive orders. He has signed a fraction of the executive orders that Bush signed or that Bush's daddy signed. I mean, so first of all, we know that's a lie, but it doesn't keep them from making that argument because they know that the American public has become so damn dumbed down that they can sell that. They're comfortable with it, aren't they?
Well, just remember that the people that they're appealing to think that Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann are good presidential candidates and real material for the presidency. So let's look at Paul Bruen to see what's happening on the stump. This is the guy who's running for the Senate in Georgia. He says that Obama has veered totally out of control, and what he uses as examples of that are the IRS abusing conservative groups. He says of Shakespearean proportions. If it's Shakespearean, it must be Much Ado About Nothing. That was such a non-issue. But now let's look at this. He's still attacking Obama on Obamacare, the ACA being imperialism. It was passed by the House, it was passed by the Senate, it was signed by the President, it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, it was upheld again by the public, who reelected Obama. You compare the Republican actions on Obamacare, they refused to accept the constitutional law of the land. They voted to repeal it 40 times. It's a complete waste of legislative time because if they do pass or repeal, Obama would veto it. But it remains a centerpiece of the Republican campaigns and the centerpiece centerpiece of Ryan's new budget.
Town hall meetings, it's in the budget, it's that same drone. And here's what's really ugly. The people watching this that, you know, call themselves GOP teabaggers, they won't admit that really the only people who really buy into this is the insurance industry that's pumping all the money into making this happen. And never even with that, for example, the ACA, even with the money being pumped in, 7+ million people have signed up. Actually, the numbers are going to be higher. I think they're going to be closer to 8 or 9 million. We have 8 or 9 million people that didn't have insurance that have it. We have people walking out of insurance offices clapping their hands because they're paying $25 a month for insurance and they can actually get coverage. But the point is, rather than being able to deal with the logic of that, you see, the Republicans have hired very good people that always outmaneuver Democrats where it comes on the message. And the message is, this is an imperial president. He thinks he's king. He's pushing his power around. And when you compare what he did, what he has done in this administration to what Bush did, there's no comparison. It's not even a close call here.
Well, this is a Frank Luntz term, imperial presidency. He does focus groups. He comes up with things that sell to this demographic. This imperial presidency works in at least 3 ways. It gets voter turnout of the conservative base. It's how the Tea Party won in 2010, and it leads to extreme fundraising among the conservatives. And Obama prodded them directly in his State of the Union message when he said, Republicans are walking contradictions. That he has little choice but to use executive power in this polarized climate. And his spokesman said, we want to work with Congress. If not, we'll do it ourselves. But we see no political downside to this. So,
well, you or I would say to the president, do it yourself. But truthfully, let's look at it from our angle. From our angle, where we're being honest about this president hasn't done enough. He hasn't used the power of the pen enough. He has not used I'm fine with imperial power if it improves this country right now.
Exactly.
But the truth is, he hasn't done that enough. He's timid. He's a compromiser. He's always trying to reach across the aisle rather than understanding that we're dealing with thugs. On the other side of the aisle are thugs. And I wonder, as I watch this unfold, Howard, whether it has something to do with the idea that they know that about this president. They know that he is so timid. He is so afraid to make a move that by doing this deal with, oh, you're the imperial president, you're proclaiming yourself king, whether or not he takes that together with the fact that he's an African American and he says, well, maybe you're right, maybe you ought to back off, and so we'll have 2 more years of this president basically doing nothing. Is that something that concerns you?
Well, it is something that concerns me. And the other thing that concerns me is Congress has been setting him up. The Republicans have been setting him up. And it's not just the right wing, the far right wing. The leader, Eric Cantor, issued a 33-page report on the imperial presidency. In March, the House Republicans devoted a week of useless legislation to introducing bills to curb Obama's imperial presidency. What they're doing, it's a complete waste of legislative time, but it's a good political move. What they're doing is setting him up so that they can say, okay, we tried to pass all these things to curb all this, and he just keeps rolling right along with his imperial presidency. Now, will this change things in the red states? Will it make the red states get redder? That doesn't matter. What matters is these same tactics worked in 2010 to launch the Tea Party. So is this imperial presidency going to resonate with the independents? Unlikely. Will it resonate with progressives? No. But it will resonate in the Republican-based town hall meetings, definitely. And it
turns the nuts out. For example, when they have a town hall meeting in my town, if you go there, if you can even get close, you feel like you are in an insane asylum. I mean, that is what happens in these town hall meetings. This is merely something to introduce into the insane asylum, have them ranting and raving and raising hell about things that they don't even understand. So this is that talking point that is that red meat talking point that lets the folks in the institution get really rattled. That's what you're saying here, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is what bothers me about it. It can lead to greater conservative voter turnout, greater base fundraising, and in midterm elections, this could swing the control of the United States Senate to the Republicans. It's worked before. It could work again as the Republicans continue to repeat this phrase and other phrases in their town hall meetings and on that echo chamber known as Fox News.
As we already see right now, when the election was lost down in Tampa, Florida, well, all of a sudden you have Democrats that are saying, oh my gosh, we can't talk about Obamacare because this candidate lost because of Obamacare. No, she lost because she was a bad candidate. But so Democrats, again, are going to be quiet. They're not going to be pushing back. They're not going to be loud, and they're going to get trounced again in midterm elections. This is why Nate Silver says the Democrats are going to lose in the midterms.
Right. President Clinton is urging Democrats to go out and embrace Obamacare, run on Obamacare, brag about, and bring something refreshing to the public on Obamacare, which is the facts and the truth. If the truth and the facts are known about the Affordable Care Act, it would be a wonderful platform for Democrats to run on, but they're timid themselves and they won't do it.
They're so timid. And you know what? The truth is, they're going into these elections, Howard, if you really try to figure out what the message is, I have a hard time doing that. I have a very difficult time trying to figure out what in the hell the message is for the Democrats, because it's almost as if they move into this mode where they disappear. Their message disappears. All they want to do is they become so timid that they don't push back at all. And I think that's what Clinton was trying to tell them. I think they needed to be a lot more aggressive on issues besides just ACA. But Howard Nations, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks.
%47% of consistent conservatives cited Fox News as their main source for news about government and politics. They expressed greater distrust than 24 of the 36 news sources. And 88% of consistent conservatives trust Fox News. So what you have with conservatives is a completely closed circuit. When they're on Facebook, they're more likely than those in any other ideological group to hear political opinions that are in line with their own views. Again, they're basically in just an echo chamber. And this is not just an echo chamber where they're trying to carry a message. This is an echo chamber where none of their assumptions are ever questioned. They are more likely to have friends who share their own political views. 2/3 say most of their close friends share their views on government and politics. In other words, They are completely sequestered.
Yeah, completely surrounded with the very notions that are so crazy.
Now, consistent liberals are far less unified in their media loyalty. They range on a wide range of media outlets. NPR, New York Times, but many, many others. They express more distrust of 28 out of the 36 news outlets in the survey. NPR, PBS, and the BBC are the most trusted news sources for consistent liberals. They're more likely than those in other ideological groups to defriend someone on a social network. In other words, they'll get offended quicker because of politics, but they are not more likely to have only friends within their political sphere. It gives you an indication of how someone like Michael Savage, how someone like Chris Christie does well in the Republican Party, but not so much outside of it.
Well, doesn't it also cure you of this? Why would you spend a minute trying to talk to one of these boneheads at a cooler? You know what my MO is? Here it is. I get, as you might imagine, we get all the troll hate mail. I play with that. I have fun with that. And they're not used to that. They're not used to these attacks. They're the ones in the attack mode. But if you have fun with it, if there's no way you're ever, these people that you'll see it sometimes, Sam, you'll see on some kind of, whether it's a Twitter chain or something like that, they're trying to talk logic to these fools. Why would you take a second to do that? The approach is, and I really believe this, and I used to, you'd hear, oh, well, why do you want to alienate them? Shit, they're insane already. Why do you want to worry about alienating some idiot at a water cooler who has an IQ of room temperature, who listens to Mike Savage and Fox? So I mean, why worry about that?
Yeah, I agree with you totally on this, Pap. I mean, a lot of people say you can't just preach to the choir. Well, the reality is, and it's a sad reality in many respects, but we have a huge percentage of people in this country who have no idea who the vice president is. We have at least 35% of the country is not aware that the Senate is up for grabs. Higher numbers of people who aren't aware who actually controls the Senate right now. And the reality is that those people who are informed, those people who pay attention, those people who basically engage in media resources and in the world at large, we need to count on those people to do a lot of the fighting in politics. And for those people who are locked in a bubble, there is no piercing it. There's nothing that you or I are going to say, or that somebody at the cooler is going to say, when that person goes and listens to Rush Limbaugh for 3 hours, and then listens to Sean Hannity for another 3 hours, and then Michael Savage for 3 hours, and then watch Bill O'Reilly for 3 hours. Those people, there's no way to reach them, but they are valuable, I think.
For what?
I'll tell you,
for what?
For showing other people who don't spend their time in those closed circles, just how dangerous they are.
Well, look, the point is look, here it is. And not necessarily, I'm not speaking for you, but our theory is attack, 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 and then take a breather and attack again. That's what we do on the Ring of Fire site. That's what I do on the Ring of Fire radio. That's what I do on Free Speech TV. And these Birkenstock Democrats can say, oh, how horrible, you're alien. Hell, I don't really care. I don't care if I'm alienating them. I wouldn't even want to sit down and have a beer with them, for God's sakes. Why do I care?
One of the things that's been sort of fascinating and incredibly annoying is not just the overhyping of Ebola as a danger to us in this country. It has been absolutely over the top. There was a story out in New Jersey this past week where 2 kids from East Africa who come from Rwanda were kept out of school for 21 days because people were afraid they could be carrying Ebola, when in fact the Ebola outbreak is 2,600 miles away from them in Africa. That's how ridiculous it's gotten. And part of the reasons, and I know that you've been on television talking about why there's such hype. I've been doing the same. Part of the reason why there has been such hype is because you have a half dozen, at least, Republican senatorial candidates out there talking about Ebola as if it was the next ISIS, and the last ISIS as if it was Ebola. All of these things are Armageddon. We see it on
Yeah, I mean,
Fox.
the real Ebola out there is Sarah Palin and Rick Perry and Ted Cruz. That's the real Ebola out there.
And we see Fox News harping about it constantly, and there's a reason for this. And part of the reason is there's been studies in the past that have shown that, back in I think it was Calvin Coolidge's day, if there were shark attacks in a certain area on a beach in New Jersey, that area would actually vote for the incumbent less. And so there's a lot of political scientists. Oh yeah, there's a lot of political science out there that shows that if your home team wins, you tend to vote for the incumbent more. And so the idea
Send me that. I'll use that material. I like that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you and certainly the Republicans know this. If they can create the notion that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, it will drive out their crazies to the polls to vote against a Democratic senator or a Democratic congressperson,
like Walking Dead,
Right, exactly, because they want to blame President Obama. And so when we see Republicans on television talking about we should have a travel ban, even though all the experts say that's not the best way to go. Or when we see
and then they give good reasons, by the way, very good reasons on why that's not the way to go. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, indeed, yeah. I mean, look, I'm agnostic. I'll do what the public health experts suggest. That's what I'm going to sign on to because they're public health experts. And but
isn't Ted Cruz a public?
I think according to him, he is.
I think Ted Cruz is a really smart
he's only
guy,
not a scientist when it comes to global warming. After that, he's a bioethicist. He's an expert on all sorts of science.
He's a fraud. Yeah.
Indeed. And one of the things that you've been seeing is, of course, the Republicans trying to tie in the failure of addressing Ebola to the extent that it hasn't been addressed. And frankly, I think the CDC may have been a little bit slow on the uptake, but is now on top of this.
Well, what about this story, Sam, where I followed this one where, the Republicans block any effort to appoint a Surgeon General.
Right,
okay? They do everything they can, and now they're saying to Obama, damn it, if you had a Surgeon General, we could deal with this problem. We've got the Surgeon General vacancy, and it's your fault that this is all out of control. If you'd have done your job. Well, and of course, the reason they can say that is because the voting public is so stupid. They don't remember that it was the Republicans that blocked the Surgeon General. They don't have any idea that they filibustered, that they had press conferences, that you had Meet the Press. You had Roy Blunt from Missouri had to come up and talk about why he blocked the Surgeon General. These are leaders in the party that are all having to admit once they're put under a little microscope. Can you imagine Chuck Todd was actually the guy that pinned down Roy Blunt on this issue?
The thing I think that you're right that Americans also don't realize is that the reason why they blocked this nominee, Vivek Murthy, was because Murthy had said that guns kill people. Mm-hmm. And the NRA told its Republican puppets, look, we're going to score this vote. In other words, if you vote for this guy or allow this nomination to proceed, we're going to give you a demerit. And when it comes to voting time, we're going to talk about how we've given you a demerit. And these Republicans, they simply caved.
Oh, let me just tell you something. They were out in force against having any Surgeon General appointed. They want as many vacancies as they can because, hey, they're still holding out for Mitt Romney. Scott Brown comes out and says, Scott Brown makes the statement, we would have no Ebola problem at all if we would have I swear I'm not making this up. We would have no Ebola problem if we would have only elected Mitt Romney. Scott Brown, running for Senate, actually says that.
Yeah, pretty stunning. I'm not exactly sure what Mitt Romney was supposed to do with Ebola, but there's also a lesson here. There was a earlier this week on Meet the Press, you had an analyst from the Council of Foreign Relations in addressing why we haven't seen an Ebola vaccine. And it's very, it was a very important comment, particularly, in light of all this sort of libertarian Republican ideology. She told the story that, yes, there was a Project BioShield started by the NIH that was to get incentives to industry to come up with vaccines. The NIH was developing vaccines. But the problem is, at the end of the day, is that the free market, the profit motive, has no incentive to to develop and to produce Ebola vaccine at a time where there's no Ebola outbreak. They don't want to sit on these Ebola vaccines for 5 years, 10 years, whatnot. I mean, this is a perfect example of why we need government, why government is the only thing that can solve these sort of large, massive problems where profit motive actually works against finding a solution, because there's just not enough people, or nobody wants the carrying costs of amortizing this cost out the next 20 years for when they're really going to need a solution for it. We see this time and time again. Privatization is always problematic when it comes to real societal problems.
Well, baby, it is the new trend. Republicans get in the Senate. You talk about, man, roads will be privatized, rivers will be privatized. Hell, we'll probably sell New York City to some conglomerate from friggin' China. That's it for this week's Ring of Fire. You can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.